Hi, everybody. Welcome to Literature, Language, Culture, a dialogue series here at the University of Washington English Department on the Seattle campus. This is our first episode featuring two guests, mostly in dialogue with each other. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And Jeff and Anna, would you mind introducing yourselves?
I can go first. I'm Anna Preus. I'm Assistant Professor of Humanities Data Science, and I'm in the English department, and I just started at UW this fall. So excited to be here.
And I'm Geoffrey Turnovsky. I'm Associate Professor in French and Italian Studies, specializing in early modern culture and print culture. I also co-direct with Jeff Knight in English, the Textual Studies program at the UW.
Jeff and Anna, what should people expect to learn about in today's episode?
Well, we're going to be talking about the Text Encoding Initiative, which is a set of standards for marking up texts in extensible markup language, or XML, but I promise it's more exciting than that sounds.
I think we'll be talking about, some of the ways in which it's, pertinent to both, teachers and students of humanistic and literary and cultural texts, and why it might be relevant to bring up in a classroom, for example.
For today's episode, you will find a link in the description, both podcast and on YouTube, where you can find all of the references and some additional readings. For this episode, there'll be more information on the screen. So if you listen to the podcast, I really recommend you check out the YouTube version for this one, or you check out that reading list. Again, like and subscribe. I'll say it again at the end. And then if you've been a little bit concerned about following today's content, we have a special section just for vocabulary. So you'll find a link to the timestamp for that below, or you can just watch and listen to the whole thing and you'll still catch it. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So what did you two bring to talk with us about today?
We brought TEI, which is the Text Encoding Initiative. It is a set of guidelines for encoding text in extensible markup language, or XML.
Yeah, we thought it was a kind of a useful artifact to discuss a lot of our intersecting interests, both in the sort of history of text production and things like editing, and in questions around digitization, which I think is a very germane issue right now. So much of our materials that we're working with are being accessed online.
And what does this have to do with humanities and social sciences scholarship in particular? And so when I hear like HTML, markup language, etc., I just think coding, right? But why is this important to think about in the fields of research that you do? Because it's not commonly associated with your fields, right?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons we were drawn to talking about TEI is because it is a system that's designed to work with texts across languages, across time periods, across formats. So it's basically an attempt to create a standardized way of marking up any kind of text so that it can be put online or accessed digitally. And so if we're working across different centuries and across different languages, I think what's cool about TEI is this attempt to make a system for encoding text that works across disciplines. And as you know, I'm a humanist, we are highly text-based. And so many texts are being moved online right now, and so many of us are working with them digitally. That sort of TEI gives us a way of understanding some of the kind of choices behind how they're encoded and put online. That's not everything, though. Jeff, if you want to add.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've actually found that, I use it a lot in the classroom. I don't do a lot of it outside in my own research, but I found it incredibly kind of useful tool for, for work with text in the classroom. And in fact, it's really a very sort of direct extension of all the things that we were doing pre-digitization, encoding. It's a way to kind of model a text for digitization, let's say, but it's very analytical, and it requires you to kind of break down a text the way we would break down a text if you were just doing a kind of more, in quotes, traditional literary analysis of a text. I mean, you identify the genre, you kind of identify the different parts. I mean, you tag the text for all of these things that, we, in the course of a sort of normal literature class, would be training students to look for anyway. So I've always found it to be very much, in continuity with some of the things that we do as humanists and literary scholars in our classes, but in our research too.
What is encoding? When you say you encode a text, what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, encoding is when you apply tags to a text that describe or somehow, mark off a particular section of the text, and it's done according to in the case of XML, according to a particular vocabulary where you would be able to understand what that code is saying about the content within the two tags. And of course, I mean, it connects with the whole tradition of bibliography and editing. I mean, it's it's the most common sort of authoritative, let's say, format, set of protocols or guidelines for, preparing a text for digital representation in a way that's standardized, will be familiar to others. It's a shared vocabulary for marking up a text using XML.
You mentioned that you do this a lot in your classrooms as an assignment. Do you mind giving a kind of example or kind of narrating what that looks like in the class? And
Sure.
For folks that are like, I don't see what this has to do with close reading, that might also be a way to bridge that for us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a series of different steps, and I think the biggest challenge is to plan for it in a class. I mean, you have to kind of, have the time frame set up well so that students have the ability to, first you have to kind of understand what XML is, and then you have to learn the specific XML vocabulary of TEI. It's not very difficult at all. It just takes a little bit of time, particularly when you're introducing it in a context where students aren't at all expecting to do that kind of work. But I've done it at the undergraduate level. I've done it at a very basic level in the context of an undergraduate class that had nothing to do with this, but just as a kind of one-day exercise. I've done it as a more developed kind of quarter-long project for undergrads, and I've done it for grad students who are more savvy about what DH is and sort of understand better the sort of the utility of learning these kinds of skills. But either present them with or have them choose a text. They would transcribe it or find a transcription of it, and that's a whole discussion in and of itself. So then they have a digital version of that text, and then they just mark it up. I mean, you teach them the basics of what a TEI document looks like. It's sort of components. It's, XML is a set of 500 plus elements. I mean, these are the sort of bracketed tags that people would be familiar with if they've seen HTML. I mean, it looks very similar. And they're used to identify things like lines of poetry or paragraphs. And so there's a very sort of basic vocabulary you can learn, a small subset of those 500 elements. You provide them to the students, and they just go through using ideally an XML editor, and they just add those tags to the text. I mean, it ends up being very, it seems there's a fairly steep learning ramp that I think is very short, and at a certain point, once you get it, it's actually pretty simple. I mean, XML is very simple. And if you have a small set of TEI tags, it doesn't take that long to figure out how to use them and how to apply them to a text.
I have an even more basic question, and then one that might not be as basic as it seems to me. The basic one is, do you mind kind of walking through a little bit, say an example of a text where you've done this and what the students get out of it, like why learn to do it, right? And what do they come away from that with? If we're imagining people picturing someone marking up a text, right? Like I think mark up a text, like grab a book and start like annotating it, right? But you're using markup in a completely different way. So that's the first one. And then if you're open to it as an example, I'm curious about how you can do this with poetry, just based on my experience with poetry and ebooks being a messy ordeal because of line breaks and yeah.
So I think maybe if I can back up even one step further and say, so I'm used to teaching XML sort of backwards, like looking at a document that's been produced or a website that's been produced through XML and then going back and seeing how that was sort of engineered, which can also be really interesting. But so one thing that I think is particularly useful about XML as a pedagogical tool and TEI as a pedagogical tool is that XML is so vast. It stands for extensible markup language. Basically, it's made to be sort of endlessly adaptable and endlessly extendable. And so then TEI narrows it down, but doesn't narrow it down that much because TEI still wants to give you a bunch of options. So one of my favorite things to have students think about, even if we aren't doing technical markup, is what would you mark up in this text? So you have a text. What would you note? Would you note formal characteristics? Would you note words in different languages? Would you note proper nouns? Would you note the structure of the text, sort of chapters versus, headings, things like that? And so I think that process of like, you are, when you insert these tags, essentially marking information that a computer can then go back and find, or someone who's searching can go back and find. And what's cool about XML is that it's human and machine readable. So like you can read it as a person, but a computer can also read it. So asking students to make those choices about like what they would mark up, or going in and looking sort of behind the scenes of a website and being like, oh, what did they mark up? Oh, they marked up formatting information, but they didn't actually format this as a poem with poetic lines. It's just formatted as a paragraph of text, or, whatever that might be. I'm not really getting at your specific question about the like example of how I've used it in class, but I do think that that kind of like reverse engineering moment. Okay, this is appearing online. What got encoded initially to make it appear this way is useful. And then, in the kind of like vast possibilities of XML and more specifically TEI, asking students, okay, you have a text. What is important to tag so that people can go back and search for it later?
Yeah, I think one of the key points I try to insist on in class, and I think it's a little bit counterintuitive because when students see XML, they think HTML, and they think that this is a set of instructions to a browser of how to kind of represent something on a screen in a browser. But it's important to understand that XML and TEI in particular, well, maybe TEI specifically in this case, is a form of descriptive markup. You're describing a text, you're pointing back to a source. There's nothing implied about what one should do with that text. This is why I think the reverse engineering is such an important way of approaching it. The version you see on the screen is just one possibility, that one endpoint, one outcome that one can imagine based on, however the text was originally marked up with TEI. But that entails, if the objective of TEI is to describe a text, that you have an idea of what that text is. You have a definition of what the text is. What its relationship is with its material instantiation. Is it an addition that you're marking up? Is it a kind of abstract work that you're marking up and you don't care about layout on a page or anything like that? Are you really interested in, as you mentioned, poetic structure, for example? You can, incorporate all kinds of information about verse and meter, all sorts of information that would convey to a computer and to a human reader who can read the XML, information about the sort of poetic nature of the work. You can ignore all of that. You can see the work as just an inscription on a surface. There's a whole set of tags for dealing with just a kind of a visual artifact, something that isn't, understanding the text in that sense, as kind of one surface with writing on it. But that I think is an important pedagogical exercise for students and I think connects very much with our work as humanists and sort of literary and cultural scholars. Just defining, what a text is. Trying to sort of identify what we see as its most important components. There's an interpretive layer to all of that too, of course, as there is in any editorial work. You make choices about what is important in this text when you decide what you're going to describe through XML.
So I'm going to project my cultural studies mind for a moment into it. And what I'm hearing is that it can be actually a form of historical erasure if a text is encoded, removing specific pieces of information, or there might be ways that people choose, whether they realize they're choosing it or not, to mark it up in a way that serves like a kind of dominant reading practice. Right. I think usually when I hear about it, I think of accessibility first. So I think about, okay, if someone uses a screen reader and they need access to an ebook of poetry, how do you make sure they're getting the same experience as possible of the layout of the poem and the form as if it were performed by the poet, or as someone who sees the poem on the page and can do an analysis based on what they see and so on, right? So there's the accessibility point that I have where I'm like, okay, it sounds like there's some stakes there. I'm curious if, and this is where it's your expertise, you can tell me if I'm projecting too much, but if there's similar ramifications and stakes for different historically marginalized or erased or kind of partially erased texts. And if there are, either way, accessibility or thinking about broader like historical marginalizations, any examples you can think of. And if I'm off base on both those questions, then we can just distill it down to what are the stakes. Makes sense.
So there are sort of ramifications in terms of like erasure and attention paid to individual texts in terms of like how much human labor is put into putting them online, right? So we have millions of texts that have been digitized by major online libraries in an automated manner through OCR, optical character recognition. If you've tried to use the kind of text, the scrolling text versions of those texts, you may have realized that there are a lot of errors. And, so there's that model of mass digitization. And then there are these sort of like often like intensive, small scale editing projects that people put like a ton of care into digitizing individual texts. I've been involved in one of those projects and it has taken me years to encode a 500-line poem. So like those are not always replicable. So I think texts fall in the gaps there, right? And sort of don't have humans encoding them at all. But then I think there's also that question of when we decide what we mark up, sort of what gets lost, you also can potentially like over tag and be sort of defining what is findable within a particular text based on your own sort of motivations for encoding that text. So I think that there's on the one hand, all kinds of stuff that gets left out. For example, if the text is primarily encoded in English, but there's a word in another language and it's not tagged and it's misread by the computer, like, does that even get included, that word in another language, in any kind of understandable way? At the same time, if I went into the poem I've been encoding and tried to like, note every reference to an advertisement, that's, I would miss some, or I would overemphasize the importance of advertisements to this poem if that was the only thing I did. So I do think that there are implications both in terms of like which texts get human encoded and have that kind of editing labor that Jeff is talking about, and also then when you are encoding a text, sort of how you choose to view it and what you choose to sort of tag and make more findable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one reason we thought TEI was a very interesting artifact to talk about, because it's really kind of at that, it brings up these issues about, sort of tensions between small and mass digitization projects. And, at some level, the stakes are the stakes that underlie any digitization project. You're trying to make things, it's a project of transmediation to try to make an archive accessible now in this different medium for the future. Mass digitization, of course, through OCR and scanning will enable you to digitize a lot more material, but at individual levels, there's huge amounts of loss. The nature of that individual text, TEI, works much more at a small scale. It can capture much more at that individual level, but of course, there's a limit to how much you can do when it's much more dependent on human labor and much less automated, although there are ways to do automated TEI as well. And there's sort of a middle ground, which is an interesting one to explore, and I think probably doesn't get talked about as much as it should, because there's quite a bit of it out there, sort of fairly large scale databases that are tagged in TEI, tagged through automated processes that look for paragraphs and then put in the paragraph tags on each end. I was going to add here too, and I think maybe this is, maybe I don't know if this is quite the right place to talk about it, but it might be. But TEI at one level can come across as very normative in its sort of categories, its conceptualization of the text. It's a very hierarchical, like XML. It's a very hierarchical data model where you've got a box. You've got sort of boxes inside boxes. You've got the text. You've got its body, you've got its chapters, major divisions, and then paragraphs inside that and so forth. And it's a little bit hard to work it's a little bit hard to work around that. The XML grammar is quite strict on that point. And, TEI has fairly normative, established codes for sort of describing these boxes, paragraphs and so forth, divisions that, tend to get kind of typed as as chapters, let's say, or sections. But I think TEI, the sort of community, the people who are in charge of the guidelines, have always been very conscious of this, and they've tried to develop lots of workarounds. So including things like, new kinds of elements that allow you to describe a text without recourse to, what might seem a very sort of traditional sort of structural approach to the text. TEI is also very adaptable, like XML is. XML is sort of infinitely adaptable. TEI is set up as a set of guidelines that you are invited, almost required to change for your specific purposes. And there's, different ways of doing that. And it can be kind of complicated, but it's open-ended and is versatile and is open for adaptation for specific needs if the particular set of rules and guidelines don't quite match what your goals are, what your needs are.
What does this have to do with the new data sciences degree option coming in classes that people take?
Data sciences are really about working at scale with data, and TEI, in a sense, is sort of at the opposite end. It's small scale. If you ask the sort of pure data science people if TEI counts as data science, I don't know really what they would say, if they would consider it. We're going to find out, actually, because we're going to propose some courses for the data science minor that, one of which is sort of built around TEI and digital editing. And but there are these sort of technical computational skills at the heart of it, and they are, particularly suited to humanistic work. It's one thing when you're in the world of the social sciences, and I don't know that TEI makes much sense over there, but when you're in the humanities and in literary studies and you're working with text, this is really one of the main ways in which we kind of interact with text computationally, and mostly for the purposes of rendering a text in a browser as a digital edition. But you can do all kinds of processing with TEI. XML is a database. Basically it's a protocol for developing a database. That's what TEI is. When you encode a text with TEI, you're turning that text into data. So in my mind, it fits in perfectly. It just depends how much scale is important in all of this, and we touched on the question of scale and where TEI fits in. But to my mind, it's part of humanities data science. I don't know, Anna, if you have a different perspective on this.
So I totally agree with everything you just said. And I also think that, for me, just speaking personally, before I got into using code to take apart text, I was encoding text. And I think in terms of teaching, having experience with encoding and marking up text really helps in terms of understanding what we do when we then try to go back and get at them in an automated way using something like Python or R. Because, if you're doing web scraping, for example, you're moving through a hierarchical structure trying to find the text that you want to then pull to scrape to analyze. And so if you've marked up text in a hierarchical structure with XML, that's going to help you understand how those elements are nested, and how you go search for the tag you need to find to then get at the text you actually want to pull. And practically speaking, we're also often getting rid of XML tags when we're trying to read in text. So it can also if you, for example, want to just get a bunch of words out of a text, but you're dealing with a text that's been encoded in a hierarchical manner, it will, having done that process of encoding, is going to help you understand what you're pulling out when you just sort of take all the words and then dump them into Python to try to analyze. So I think it's really, really important in that sense too. I wouldn't have wanted to just jump right into larger scale text analysis without first understanding how texts are encoded, sort of, and whether or not they're encoded in TEI. TEI gives you a very good and sort of standardized, but also flexible way of entering into how that's done.
What's an example of using TEI that gives you a lot of hope and excitement about the future right now? So if you've seen any examples where you're like, that's so cool, it makes me feel a lot of like hope. I don't like the word optimism. It makes me feel a lot of hope for like where things are headed in the world or in the humanities or just in general, even as specific as like it excites me about a new possibility.
I mean, one project that I really like and gives me hope is Women of the Early Harlem Renaissance. And it's a project by Amardeep Singh and a collaborative project. He included undergraduates as well. And it's a collection of texts by women writers that are understudied, that were key in the kind of formation of the literary movement that we now refer to as the Harlem Renaissance, or sometimes refer to it that way. And so what I think is really cool about that is it applies individual attention to specific texts and has that sort of editorial labor, and it's collaboratively done. But at the same time, it's multiple texts. It's not just a single work or a single author or like a single corpus. It is a kind of range of different texts that have all had this scholarly labor applied to them. And so I think that is a really cool project and a model I'm really interested in.
I'll answer this question a little bit differently, just in part because I've been so, like for me, it's been so much about classroom applications rather than sort of me working on projects or being even that aware of projects outside of the classroom. But I've just found like students are really engaged this TEI. I mean, they get excited by it. And, there's definitely there's resistance one has to work through, particularly with some students. I mean, some of them take to it right away, but there's definitely students who initially kind of wonder why we're doing this, and they don't like computers, and they're in this class, they're in a French class in my case, because they don't want to take a computer science class. But when they sort of understand the relationship of TEI and of that kind of work to their work in French studies or in literary studies or in the humanities, they get into it. They see it as interesting, as kind of eye-opening, as kind of pertinent. And I've never had a student, I've done it probably 4 or 5 times in different classes, and I've never really had a student who just didn't get it, who just up to the end wasn't happy about it. I mean, of all the exercises I've had students do in class to try to get them interested in the work we do in these classes, it's one that has one of the highest success rates, and makes me sort of optimistic about, the future of the kind of materials we like to teach and the kinds of topics we like to teach. There are ways to do it to, sort of energize. I mean, there are many ways to do it to energize students, but this is definitely one of the more effective ones that I've come across.